The room was quiet, except for the sound of breathing. 43 people packed into a conference room designed for 20. All eyes on her. Sarah Mitchell sat at the end of the long table, hands folded, refusing to look down. She had been called worse things in her life, but never in front of this many witnesses. Never with this much money on the line. "You're lying." The words came from Margaret Hendricks, her voice cutting through the stale air like a blade. Margaret was 71, impeccably dressed, the kind of woman who had spent her entire life being believed without question. "You show up here with nothing but a story and expect us to hand over a third of everything our father built." Sarah didn't respond. Not yet. She had learned that silence could be its own form of power. Around the table, the Hendricks family sat in a formation that looked almost military. Margaret at the head. Her brother Robert to her right, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Robert's wife Jennifer beside him, whispering something that made him nod. Their 3 adult children scattered among the other relatives, all of them watching Sarah with identical expressions of contempt. This was not how inheritance hearings were supposed to go. But nothing about the last 6 months had gone the way anyone expected. "We need to go back." Back before the conference room. Before the lawyers, the accusations. Back to the beginning. When Thomas Hendricks was still alive and no one knew that his death would tear apart everything. His family thought they understood about their own history. Thomas Hendricks died on March 14th, 2023. At the age of 9, he passed away in his sleep at the Riverside Manor Assisted Living Facility in Portland, Oregon, where he had spent the last 3 years of his life. The death was not unexpected. Thomas had been declining for months, his heart failing, his mind still sharp enough to recognize his children when they visited, though those visits had become less frequent as the end approached. Thomas had built his fortune slowly and carefully. He started as a machinist in the 1950s, worked his way up to plant manager, then opened his own manufacturing company in Hendricks Precision Tools. By the time he sold the company in 2005, it was worth $11.3 million. Thomas kept most of that money, invested it conservatively, lived modestly in the same house in Northeast Portland that he had bought in 19. When he died, his estate was valued at just under $9 million. The house, now worth $800,000 in Portland's inflated real estate market. Stock portfolios, bonds, a small cabin on the Oregon coast, cash in various accounts. His will was straightforward, or it seemed that way at first. Margaret Hendricks, his daughter, 68 years old at the time of his death, a retired school teacher, married 46 years to the same man, 3 children, 6 grandchildren. She expected to inherit half. Robert Hendricks, his son, 65 years old, a semi-retired accountant, 2 marriages behind him, 3 children from the first marriage, none from the second. He expected to inherit the other half. The will named them both as primary beneficiaries, splitting the estate equally between them. 95% of the assets, divided 50-50. The remaining 5% designated for a few small charitable donations, and a bequest to a caretaker who had helped Thomas in his final years. It was clean, simple, exactly what everyone expected. The funeral was held on March 20th at Willamette Valley Memorial Gardens. 112 people attended. Family, former business associates, old friends from the neighborhood. Margaret gave a eulogy, describing her father as a man of principle, someone who valued honesty and hard work above all else. Robert spoke about fishing trips they had taken when he was young, about the lessons his father had taught him about integrity and family. No one mentioned Sarah Mitchell, because at that point, no one in the family knew she existed. The will went into probate. Standard procedure. Margaret and Robert met with the estate attorney, a man named Gerald Voss, who who had handled Thomas's legal affairs for the past 20 years. The meeting was scheduled for April 5th at Voss's office in downtown Portland. Gerald Voss was 73 years old, methodical, the kind of lawyer who had seen every variation of family conflict that death and money could produce. He sat across from Margaret and Robert in his wood-paneled office and walked them through the document page by page. Everything matched what they expected. Until page 7. "There's an additional clause here," Voss said, adjusting his reading glasses. "Added to the will in December of 2022, about 3 months before your father's death." Margaret leaned forward. "What kind of clause?" "A directive regarding potential claims against the estate. Your father specifically instructed that if any person came forward claiming to be a biological child of his, that claim should be investigated through DNA testing before the estate is finalized." The room went very still. Robert spoke first. "What are you talking about?" "There are no other children. It's me and Margaret. That's it. It's always been it." Voss set the document down carefully. "I'm simply reading what your father wrote. He was very specific. He said that such a claim might arise, and that if it did, it should be taken seriously." "This is insane," Margaret sighed. Her voice had lost its composure. "Our father was married to our mother for 49 years. He never cheated. He never had affairs. This is impossible." "Nevertheless," Voss continued, "the will requires that we wait 30 days after the death notice is published before finalizing any distribution. That period is to allow for any such claims to be filed, and if someone does file a claim." Robert asked, "Then we proceed with DNA testing. If the claim is validated, the estate would need to be redistributed according to Oregon inheritance law, which treats all biological children equally, regardless of when they were born or under what circumstances." Margaret stood up. "This is ridiculous. Who would even make such a claim? And why would my father think someone would?" Voss didn't answer. He simply watched them, his expression neutral, his hands folded on the desk. The death notice was published in the Oregonian on April 8th. Thomas Hendricks, age 94, survived by his 2 children, Margaret and Robert, 7 grandchildren. Funeral services already held. Remembrances can be sent to Willamette Valley Memorial Gardens. Sarah Mitchell saw the notice on April 10th. She was sitting in the break room at Providence Portland Medical Center, where she worked as a nurse in the oncology unit. 38 years old, divorced 3 years earlier, no children, living in a 1-bedroom apartment in southeast Portland that took half her paycheck every month. She didn't normally read the obituaries, but someone had left the newspaper open on the table, and the name caught her eye, Thomas Hendricks. She stared at the name for a long time, long enough that her coffee went cold, long enough that another nurse came in, said something to her, left without getting a response. Thomas Hendricks was her father. She had known this her entire life. Her mother had told her when she was 12 years old, sitting at their kitchen table in the small house they rented in Gresham. A conversation that changed everything, Sarah thought. She understood about where she came from, but Thomas Hendricks had never acknowledged her, had never met her, had never sent money or cards or any indication that he knew she existed. Until now, until a clause in a will that suggested he had been waiting for this moment. Sarah kept the newspaper. She went home that night and pulled out the box she kept in her bedroom closet. The box contained everything her mother had saved. Letters, a photograph, documents, the pieces of proof that had defined Sarah's entire understanding of her own identity. She looked at the photograph, a young woman and a young man standing in front of a lake. The woman was her mother, Linda Mishia, age 22 in the photo. Dark hair, bright smile. The man was Thomas Hendricks, age 48, his arm around Linda's waist. looking directly at the camera. On the back of the photograph, in her mother's handwriting, Lake Oswego, July 1984. Sarah had been born in April 1985. Her mother had died 6 years ago. Lung cancer, the same disease Sarah now spent her days treating in other people. Before she died, Linda had made Sarah promise something. If he ever dies, Linda had said, her voice weak, oxygen tube in her nose, you tell them. You tell his family. You make sure they know the truth. Sarah had promised, but she had never thought she would actually have to do it. Now she sat on her apartment floor with the box open in front of her and tried to decide if she was brave enough to destroy the lives of people she had never met. She contacted Gerald Voss on April 5th. She called his office, got transferred twice, finally spoke to him directly. My name is Sarah Mitchell, she said. I'm calling about the Thomas Hendricks estate. There was a pause. Then Voss asked her to come to his office. The meeting took place on April 19th. Sarah brought the box. She sat across from Voss and laid out everything she had. The photograph, 3 letters from Thomas to her mother, all from 1984, all signed with his name, all clearly personal, some of them explicit about their relationship. A birthday card from 1985 with a check for $500 signed by Thomas, with a note that said for the baby, and her birth certificate, father unknown. My mother worked as a secretary at Hendricks Precision Tools from 1983 to 1985, Sarah explained. She was 21 when she started. Thomas was 47. They had a relationship. She got pregnant. He gave her money to leave quietly. She did. He never contacted her again, except for that one card. He never met me, never called. Nothing. Voss examined each document carefully. They took notes. He asked questions about dates and details. Why didn't your mother ever pursue this legally? He asked. Because he threatened her, Sarah said. Not physically, but he made it clear that if she tried to claim he was the father, he would destroy her reputation. This was 1980. He was a successful businessman with a family. She was a single mother with no resources. She believed him, so she stayed quiet. And you stayed quiet. My mother asked me to. She said it would only cause pain. But then she got sick. And before she died, she changed her mind. She said I deserved to know where I came from, and that his family deserved to know the truth. Voss set down his pen. You understand what this will do? Yes. You understand that his children will fight this, that they will say terrible things about you and about your mother. Yes. And you want to proceed anyway. Sarah looked at him directly. He wrote that clause in his will. He knew I might come forward. Maybe he wanted me to. Maybe this is his way of finally admitting what he did. I don't know, but I'm not doing this for the money. I'm doing this because my mother asked me to, and because I'm tired of being erased. Voss nodded slowly. I'll need to inform the other beneficiaries, and we'll need to conduct DNA testing. Do you have anything with Thomas's DNA? No. But I assume you can get it from his children. We'd share DNA if he's my father. That's correct. Half-siblings share approximately 25% of their DNA. It's conclusive. He scheduled the testing for May 2nd when Gerald Voss called Margaret and Robert to inform them that a claim had been filed. The response was immediate and visceral. Margaret called him a liar. She said it was impossible. She demanded to know who this woman was, what evidence she claimed to have, whether Voss had verified anything before disrupting their family. Robert was quieter, but no less angry. He wanted to know why this woman had waited until after their father was dead, why she hadn't come forward when he was alive, when he could have defended himself. Voss explained that the claimant had documentation, that the matter would be settled through DNA testing, that Oregon law was very clear about the rights of biological children, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. "This is extortion." Margaret sighed. "She's trying to steal from us. If the DNA test proves she's not related to your father, she gets nothing," Voss replied. "If it proves she is, then she has a legal claim to a portion of the estate. It's that simple." "Nothing about this is simple," Robert said. The DNA testing was scheduled for May 2nd at a certified laboratory in Portland. Sarah Mitchell arrived at 9 in the morning. Margaret and Robert arrived 30 minutes later, accompanied by Jennifer, Robert's wife, and by Margaret's husband, David. They did not speak to Sarah. They sat on the opposite side of the waiting room and stared at her with undisguised hostility. The testing took 15 minutes per person. Cheek swabs, chain of custody documentation. Everything legally admissible. Sarah left immediately after a test was complete. Margaret and Robert stayed to speak with the laboratory technician, asking questions about accuracy rates and contamination protocols and how long the results would take. 10 to 14 business days, the technician told them. Those 2 weeks felt like years. Sarah went to work. She came. She tried not to think about what would happen when the results came back. She had no real expectation of being welcomed into the family. She didn't want that. She just wanted acknowledgement. Proof. An end to the decades of wondering if her mother had been telling the truth. If stories like this interest you, subscribing helps you catch the next one. Margaret and Robert spent those 2 weeks preparing for war. They hired a private investigator to look into Sarah Mitchell's background. They wanted to know everything: her employment history, her finances, her relationships, her mother's past. They were looking for anything that could be used to discredit her. The investigator came back with very little. Sarah Mitchell was exactly who she claimed to be: a nurse. Divorced? No criminal record, no history of fraud or deception. Her mother had indeed worked at Hendricks Precision Tools in the mid-80s. The dates matched Sarah's story perfectly, but Margaret refused to believe it. She constructed alternate explanations. Maybe Linda Mitchell had slept with multiple men and simply decided to claim Thomas was the father because he had money. Maybe Sarah herself was part of a con, using forged documents and false stories to manipulate the legal system. Robert was less certain. He remembered his father's behavior in the 80s, the late nights at the office, the business trips that seemed excessive, the tension between his parents that had never been fully explained. He had been in his 20s then, just starting his own career, not paying close attention to his parents' marriage. "Do you think it's possible?" Jennifer asked him one night as they lay in bed, unable to sleep. Robert stared at the ceiling. "I don't know. I don't want it to be possible." But Dad was very specific about that clause. He wrote it himself. Voss said he was completely lucid when he did it. Why would he do that if there wasn't something to it? Maybe he was being manipulated. Jennifer suggested. Maybe someone convinced him this woman existed. He was 91 when he wrote that clause. He wasn't senile. He knew what he was doing. The results came back on May 18th. Gerald Voss called each of them separately. He asked them to come to his office on May 22nd for a meeting where the results would be formally disclosed. "Can't you just tell me now?" Margaret demanded over the phone. "I think it's better if we discuss this in person," Voss said carefully. That was when Margaret knew. Something in his tone, the way he avoided a direct answer. She knew before she walked into that office what the results were going to say. Sarah arrived first. She sat in the same chair she had occupied during her first visit, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Margaret and Robert arrived together, along with Jennifer and David and two of Robert's children, Michael and Amanda. They filled the office, creating a wall of family between themselves and Sarah. Voss opened a folder on his desk. Inside was the laboratory report. He looked at each of them before he spoke. The DNA test results indicate that Sarah Mitchell shares approximately 25% of her DNA with both Margaret Hendricks and Robert Hendricks. This is consistent with a half-sibling relationship. The probability of this relationship is 99.98%. Silence. Then Margaret spoke, her voice shaking. "That's impossible." "The test is definitive," Voss said. "Sarah Mitchell is the biological daughter of Thomas Hendricks." "No." Margaret stood up. "No, I don't care what some test says. My father would never have done this. He would never have cheated on my mother. He would never have abandoned a child. This is wrong. The science is very clear," Voss said gently. "Then the science is lying." Margaret turned to Sarah. "Or you are. I don't know how you did this, but you're lying." Sarah met her gaze. "I'm not lying. I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you, but he was my father too." "You don't get to call him that," Margaret had sighed. "You don't get to take that from us." Robert hadn't moved. He sat perfectly still, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the report in Voss's hands. Finally, he spoke. "What happens now?" Voss explained. "Under Oregon law, all biological children are entitled to equal shares of an estate, unless specifically excluded by will. Thomas's will had not excluded Sarah. In fact, the clause he had added suggested he had anticipated her claim and wanted it to be honored. The estate would need to be redistributed. Instead of splitting $9 million between two children, it would now be split among three. Margaret and Robert would each receive approximately $3 million. Sarah would receive the same. Each of them would lose $1.5 million because of this revelation. Margaret walked out. She didn't say another word. She simply left the office, her husband following behind her, both of them moving quickly as if they couldn't breathe in the same room as Sarah. Robert stayed. He looked at Sarah for a long moment. "Did you know him?" he asked. "Did you ever meet him?" "No," Sarah said quietly. "Never. But you knew about him your whole life. Since I was 12, my mother told me. And you never tried to contact him." "My mother asked me not to. She said it would only cause pain." Robert nodded slowly. He stood up, gathered his papers, prepared to leave. At the door, he paused. "I believe you," he said. "I don't like it, but I believe you." Then he was gone. Sarah sat alone with Gerald Voss in the quiet office. "What you did took courage," Voss said. Sarah shook her head. "It just took being tired of lying." But the battle was only beginning, because Margaret Hendricks was not the kind of woman who accepted defeat quietly, and she had no intention of letting Sarah Mitchell walk away with 1/3 of her father's estate without a fight. The inheritance hearing was scheduled for June 15th. It was meant to be a formality, a legal proceeding to finalize the redistribution of the estate. But Margaret had other plans. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, she assembled a case against Sarah. She hired lawyers who specialized in estate disputes. She collected testimonies from people who had known Thomas, all of them willing to swear that he would never have had an affair, that he had been devoted to his wife. But this claim was impossible. She had her investigators dig deeper into Linda Mitchell's background. They found that Linda had dated other men around the time she would have conceived Sarah. Margaret's lawyers planned to argue that Linda had been promiscuous, that she couldn't have known for certain who the father was, that she had simply chosen to name Thomas because he was wealthy. The fact that the DNA tests proved Sarah was Thomas's daughter didn't seem to matter. Margaret was building a narrative, and she intended to use it to destroy Sarah's credibility regardless of what the science said. The hearing took place in a conference room at the Multnomah County Courthouse. It was larger than Voss's office, but it still felt overcrowded. Margaret brought 14 family members. Robert brought 8. Sarah came alone. The mediator was a woman named Patricia Moreno, a retired judge who specialized in estate disputes. She sat at the head of the table and reviewed the case file while everyone settled into their seats. Margaret's lawyer spoke first. His name was Richard Caldwell, 62 years old. Expensive suit, the kind of voice that commanded attention. Your Honor, we are here today because of a claim that has torn apart a grieving family. A claim that, while perhaps technically supported by genetic testing, is morally and ethically questionable in its motivation and timing. He went on. He talked about Sarah's sudden appearance after Thomas's death. He questioned why she had never come forward while Thomas was alive, when he could have confirmed or denied her story. He suggested that her claim was motivated purely by financial gain. Mitchell works as a nurse. She's divorced. She lives in a modest apartment. By her own admission, she knew about Thomas Hendricks her entire adult life, yet she chose to remain silent until the exact moment when his death made her claim most profitable. This is not the behavior of a daughter seeking connection. This is the behavior of an opportunist seeking money. Sarah's lawyer objected. His name was Marcus Chun, younger than Caldwell. Lispoli said, but fiercely intelligent. My client's financial situation is irrelevant. The DNA tests proves conclusively that she is Thomas Hendricks' daughter. Oregon law is clear. All biological children have equal rights to inheritance. The timing of her claim doesn't change that legal reality. But Caldwell wasn't finished. He produced testimony from Thomas's former business partner, a man who had known Thomas for 40 years and swore that Thomas had never mentioned having another child. He produced statements from neighbors who described Thomas's marriage as solid and loving. He even produced a letter that Thomas had written to Margaret in 2010, in which he had described his children, plural, meaning Margaret and Robert, with no mention of anyone else. If Thomas Hendricks truly believed he had a third child, Caldwell argued, why did he never acknowledge her? Why did he never provide support? Why did he allow her to grow up, believing she was unwanted? This was when Margaret herself spoke up. He didn't acknowledge her because she's not his daughter. Margaret had sighed her voice loud enough to carry across the room. I don't care what the test says. My father was an honest man, an honorable man. If he had gotten some secretary pregnant, he would have taken responsibility. He wouldn't have hidden it for 40 years. That's not who he was. Patricia Moreno intervened, Mrs. Hendricks. The DNA evidence is conclusive. The court has already established paternity. Then the test is wrong, Margaret said. Or it was tampered with, or she's lying about something. I don't know what she did, but I know my father, and this doesn't make sense. Sarah had been silent throughout all of this. She had listened to herself being called a liar, an opportunist, a manipulator. She had watched Margaret's family members nod along with every accusation. She had felt the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on her like something physical. Now she spoke. He did acknowledge me, Sarah said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. What? Margaret said. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. This arrived at my apartment 3 weeks ago. It was sent from a law office in Seattle. The lawyer said Thomas had left instructions that if anything happened to him, this should be delivered to me. She slid the envelope across the table to Patricia Moreno. Inside was a letter, handwritten, dated February 19, 2023. 1 month before Thomas died, Moreno read it aloud. Dear Sarah, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if you'll even want to. I've spent most of my life being a coward about what I did to your mother and to you. I told myself I was protecting my family, but really, I was protecting myself. I was ashamed. I was afraid, and I was wrong. Your mother was a good person. She deserved better than what I gave her. You deserved better. I know I can't fix that now. I know an apology means nothing after 40 years, but I wanted you to know that I thought about you. Every birthday, every Christmas. Every time I saw a young woman around your age, I wondered if it was you. I wondered what kind of person you became. I hoped you were happy. I hoped you didn't hate me. I'm an old man now. My health is failing. I won't be here much longer. I've made arrangements in my will to ensure that if you ever come forward, you'll be treated fairly. My other children don't know about you. They're going to be hurt and angry when they find out. I'm sorry for that too, but you have a right to your inheritance. Not because of the money, but because you're my daughter, and I should have said that a long time ago. I hope you can forgive me. I hope you find some peace in knowing the truth. Thomas Hendricks. The room was completely silent when Moreno finished reading. Margaret's face had gone white. She stared at the letter as if it was something poisonous. It's a forgery, she said finally. It has to be. It's been authenticated, Marcus June said. We had a handwriting expert compare it to known samples of Mr. Hendricks's writing. It's genuine. No, Margaret said. She looked at Robert. Tell them, this is fake. But Robert was staring at the letter too, and his expression was different. Not denial. Something closer to grief. It's his handwriting. Robert said quietly. You can't believe this, Margaret said. Robert, you can't. I don't want to believe it, Robert said. But I do. Look at it, Margaret. That's Dad's writing. Those are his words. He knew about her. He knew the whole time. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is insane. All of this. She shows up with some convenient letter and everyone just accepts it. What about who is S? What about the family he actually raised? We're supposed to just hand over millions of dollars to a stranger because of some guilty conscience our father apparently had. She's not a stranger, Robert said. She's our sister. Don't call her that. What else should I call her? The DNA doesn't lie. The letter doesn't lie. Dad lied. To us. To Mom. For decades. But that doesn't make Sarah the villain here. Margaret looked around the room, at the family members she had brought for support, at the lawyers she had hired to fight this battle. She seemed to realize, all at once, that she had already lost. I will never accept this, she said. Never. She walked out of the hearing. This time, only her husband followed. The rest of the family stayed, uncertain, watching the proceedings continue without her. Patricia Moreno returned to the terms of the redistribution. She outlined how the estate would be divided. She explained the timeline for transferring assets. She asked if there were any objections. Robert shook his head. No objections. Sarah said nothing. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. the letter from her father still on the table in front of her. The hearing concluded at 4:30 in the afternoon. By the time Sarah left the courthouse, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Robert caught up with her in the parking lot. "Wait," he called out. Sarah stopped. She turned to face him. "I'm sorry," Robert said. "For what Margaret said, for all of Italiano. You didn't deserve that." "It's okay," Sarah said, though her voice suggested it wasn't. "It's not okay. None of this is okay, but I wanted you to know that I don't blame you. You're right. He was your father too, and he should have done better by you." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Robert hesitated, then continued. "Would you want to get coffee sometime? Or dinner?" "I don't know. I just feel like we should talk. As family." Sarah considered this. Maybe someday, but not yet. "This is all still too raw. I understand, but if you ever want to, just let me know." He walked away, leaving Sarah alone in the parking lot, with her inheritance and a vindication and a sadness that felt heavier than either. The estate was finalized in August. Sarah received her portion, just over $3 million after taxes and legal fees. She paid off her student loans. She moved into a nicer apartment. She set up a trust fund for any future children she might have, though she doubted she would ever have them. The money didn't change her life as much as she thought it would. She still worked at the hospital. She still lived quietly. The only real difference was that she no longer worried about bills or retirement, or whether she could afford to take a vacation. But she thought about Thomas every day, the father she had never met, the man who had written her a letter apologizing for abandoning her, but only after he was safely dead and couldn't face the consequences of his actions. She didn't forgive him. She didn't hate him either. She simply carried the weight of knowing that she had spent her entire life being a secret, and that even at the end, he had chosen the easy way out. Margaret never spoke to Sarah again. She refused to acknowledge her existence. At family gatherings, if someone mentioned Sarah's name, Margaret would leave the room. She told her children and grandchildren that Sarah was a liar who had conned her way into the family fortune, and some of them believed her. Robert maintained occasional contact. He sent Sarah a Christmas card that first year. She sent one back. They met for coffee once, in September, an awkward hour where they tried to find common ground and mostly failed, but the effort mattered. In October, Sarah received another letter. This one came from a woman named Claire Hendricks, Thomas's sister, who was 89 years old and living in a nursing home in Eugene. The letter was brief. "Dear Sarah, my nephew Robert told me about you. I'm sorry for what happened. I'm sorry my brother was too much of a coward to do the right thing while he was alive. But I want you to know something. In 1985, Thomas called me one night. He was drunk, which was unusual for him. He told me he had made a terrible mistake. He said he had gotten a young woman pregnant and he didn't know what to do. I told him he needed to take responsibility. He said he couldn't. He said it would destroy his marriage, his reputation, his business. I told him those things weren't worth abandoning a child over. We fought. We didn't speak for 2 years after that. When we finally reconciled, he never mentioned it again. I never mentioned it either. I thought about it over the years, but I convinced myself it wasn't my place to intervene. I was wrong. I should have said something. I should have made him face what he did. I'm sorry. You deserved better. We all failed you. Claire. Sarah kept that letter with the others. She kept the photograph of her mother and Thomas. She kept the birthday card with the $500 check. She kept all of it in the box in her closet. A collection of evidence that proved she had once been someone's daughter, even if he had never been brave enough to say so. Years passed. The inheritance became just another fact of Sarah's life, like her name or her profession or the color of her eyes. She didn't spend it recklessly. She didn't use it to change who she was. She simply lived with it, the way she had learned to live with everything else. Margaret died in 2028. 5 years after her father, she died of a stroke, sudden and unexpected, at the age of 73. Her obituary listed her surviving family members. Sarah's name was not included. Robert called Sarah to tell her about the funeral. He asked if she wanted to attend. "Would I be welcome?" Sarah asked. "Probably not," Robert admitted, "but you have a right to be there if you want." Sarah decided not to go. She sent flowers instead, with a card that said simply, "I'm sorry for your loss." She never found out if anyone read the card or if they threw it away. Robert himself died in 2031, at the age of 73, from lung cancer. His funeral was smaller than Margaret's. Sarah attended this time. She sat in the back row, alone, and listened to Robert's children talk about what a good father he had been, how patient, how kind, how he had always tried to do the right thing, even when it was hard. After the service, Robert's daughter Amanda approached Sarah. "I'm glad you came," Amanda said. "Thank you for letting me," Sarah replied. "My father talked about you sometimes. Near the end, he said he wished things had been different. He said he wished you'd had a chance to know each other better." "Me too." Amanda hesitated, then pulled something from her purse. A photograph. It showed Thomas Hendricks at a company picnic in 1983, surrounded by employees. In the background, barely visible, was a young woman with dark hair. "I found this in my father's things," Amanda said. "I think that's your mother." Sarah looked at the photograph. It was indeed her mother, younger than Sarah had ever known her, smiling at something outside the frame. "Can I keep this?" Sarah asked. "Of course, I thought you should have it." Sarah thanked her. She left the funeral with the photograph in her hand and the strange feeling that something had finally been completed. Though she couldn't say exactly what, she was 46 years old now. Half a lifetime had passed since her mother died and asked her to tell the truth. Half a lifetime since she had walked into Gerald Voss's office with a box of letters and changed everything. She thought about that sometimes, about what would have happened if she had chosen to stay silent, if she had let Thomas's secret die with him, if she had allowed Margaret and Robert to inherit the full estate, never known that their father had spent his final months thinking about her. Would that have been easier? Probably. Would it have been right? She still didn't know. The inheritance had brought her money. It had brought her validation. It had proven that her mother had been telling the truth all those years. But it had also brought pain, conflict, the knowledge that she was unwanted by half the family that shared her blood, the understanding that some truths, no matter how accurate, are never fully accepted. Sarah kept working at the hospital. She kept living her quiet life. She kept the box in her closet with all the letters and photographs and documents that told the story of who she was and where she came from. And sometimes, late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she would take out the letter Thomas had written to her before he died. She would read his apology, his explanation, his weak justification for 40 years of abandonment. She would read the part where he said he thought about her every birthday, every Christmas, every time he saw a young woman her age. She would read the part where he said he hoped she didn't hate him, and she would think about what she would say to him if she could. If he were still alive, if they could sit across from each other and have the conversation they never had. She would tell him that she didn't hate him, that hate required a relationship, and they never had one. She would tell him that his money didn't fix anything, that it didn't replace the father she never knew or the childhood she spent wondering if she was worth claiming. She would tell him that his letter, as much as it helped her case, felt like one more act of cowardice. That apologizing from beyond the grave was easy. That facing her while he was alive would have required courage he apparently never had. And she would tell him that despite all of that, despite the anger and the pain and the decades of being erased, a part of her was glad to know the truth. Glad to have proof. Glad to know that she hadn't been imagining it. That her mother hadn't been lying. That she had come from somewhere real, even if that somewhere had never wanted to acknowledge her. But Thomas was dead. He had been dead for 8 years, and Sarah was left with the inheritance he had given her. The family that half accepted her, and the knowledge that some questions never get answered no matter how many DNA tests you take or how many letters you read. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. She returned the box to the closet. She turned off the light and went to bed. Outside, the city of Portland continued its indifferent existence, full of families and secrets and inheritances that would someday tear those families apart. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to sleep, and in the darkness, she wondered if her father had spent his final nights doing the same thing, lying awake, thinking about the choices he had made, wondering if his children would ever forgive him. She hoped he had. She hoped it had kept him awake. She hoped he had felt a fraction of the uncertainty and pain that he had inflicted on her and her mother. But she would never know. Death had protected him from accountability, the way it protected everyone in the end. All that remained was the money, the proof, and the story of a woman who had been called a liar until the DNA results arrived and made denial impossible. It wasn't justice. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't healing. It was simply the truth. Delivered too late to change anything, but early enough to confirm that Sarah Mitchell had been telling the truth all along. And sometimes, in a world full of comfortable lies, that was the most she could hope for.